right. Good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever to you, everybody. So before we get started today, I would just like to note that my 15-month-old son decided to wake up at 1:45 in the morning last night, and I wasn't able to get him to go back to sleep till about 4 a.m. So I'm solo parenting for much of this week, and if I seem a little bit out of it, this is because I'm operating on maybe about 3.5 hours of sleep and a lot of coffee. So I asked you to read for today three essays that detail social science theories that they're not designed necessarily to be applied by literature, but they frequently are lately applied to literary texts. So because it's not self-evident how you would do that, as with some of the theories we've talked about that are more kind of self-consciously literary, we'll discuss application once I've described the theories in a little bit more detail. But yeah, you were asked to read Nigel Thrift's 2008 essay, Non-Representational Theory, Life But Not As We Know It. It's actually the introduction to his book on non-representational theory. John Urry's 2006 essay on complexity, and 1996 essay by Bruno Latour on actor network theory. We've actually met Latour before. He is one of the big influences on post-critique, particularly on the work of Rita Felsky. I think most of what we say about Latour will probably be completely new and unfamiliar to you. But we can then kind of take that and think back to our post-critique discussion, and that might shed some light on what people like Felsky are trying to do. All right, so the social science approaches that we're talking about today kind of come from a branch of social science that is referred to sometimes as new materialism. So traditional sociology often deals in abstractions or generalizations of human social experience. So a traditional sociologist will usually talk about things like systems, the word structure and ideology will show up a lot. Less talk about individual human experience, more about kind of like the structures within which those experiences are embedded, if that makes sense. And so a new materialist would argue that a traditional sociologist tends to treat social phenomena as mental representations, and thus ignores affective and physical or chemical experiences. So new materialism is actually very much influenced by structuralism. It's similar to structuralism, and I think it comes from the same line of influence. We'll see a lot of references to things like semiotics, for example. But yeah, new materialists by and large acknowledge that things exist in relation to other things. Seems self-evident, right? So they study the patterns and networks of relationships between people and objects. And when we talk about things or objects, right, that includes other people, right? So relations among human beings and among, the space, within the spaces we occupy, and the things that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Hence, materialist. The physical world, according to a new materialist, is dynamic and complex, right? More on that in a little bit. So new materialism records and seeks to understand changes in the relationships within these networks of people and objects. And we're going to see as we discuss this, right, that it involves attempts to bridge the gaps between the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities, right? So it's one of those kind of interdisciplinary theories that's trying to pull several different ideas to get from different fields together, sometimes more successfully than at other times. Right, so let's dive in here to a kind of brief summary of the contents of the essays themselves. All right. So the first essay that you read was written by Nigel Thrift. And Thrift is a British geographer who works in a field that is called human geography. So when you think of geography, you might think of a class you took in middle school where you kind of like had to memorize the shapes and names of countries on a map of the world, right? And yeah, I mean that is geography, right? You know, geography is in large part about how we map out and plan space. But human geography is specifically concerned with the spatial layout of and interactions within human communities and the interactions between human communities and the natural world, right? Any interactions human beings have with the environment and with each other that has some kind of effect on space. So Thrift's concept of space is threefold. First, when he talks about space, he's talking about the material relationships within a bounded area, right? So relationships between physical objects within a specific region, right, with a specific area. But space for Thrift is also what he calls a latent world, so that it's a potentiality that is not yet fulfilled, right? Space is something that is always becoming and never completed. It's also a means of tracing and understanding movements between places and objects. Right? So the kinds of networks that a human geographer studies are created largely by human movement through space. Now, Thrift is best known as the originator of what he calls non-representational theory. So he calls it non-representational theory because he wants to focus on practices rather than representations or symbols. And let me try to explain what this means. So most human means of communication, right, are based on these kind of these symbolic systems, these sign systems. And, the sign consists of the object or concept signified, right, combined with a symbol that signifies it, right? So those two things together equal a sign. What Thrift is concerned with is kind of getting down to description of the practices themselves rather than the means that we use to try to explain or describe them, right? The ways we try to represent them either in art or in text. So Thrift argues that human beings live in, move through, and interact with a world of things. And again, things for a new materialist means people as well, right? And human subjectivity, right, that is our sense of self, our sense of individuality, our sense of agency in the world is generated through these relationships with a dynamic material world, right? So non-representational theory seeks to describe the practices through which we generate our own subjectivity through interaction with this material world that is constantly shifting, constantly changing. Now, I've chosen a rather ridiculous-looking picture of John Urry here, partly because it looks like those photographs of kids that were briefly popular in the 1980s, where you had like, you know, the child sitting in profile at the bottom in front of a black field, and then like the big kind of weird, creepy face hovering over it, and partly because I find the aesthetic of TED Talks and TEDx Talks slightly ridiculous and hilarious. So there we go. It doesn't look like he's wearing the typical headset mic, though. It looks like he's just holding a regular mic. That's a shame. So John Urry is a British sociologist, and he's mostly a lot of his work is concerned with trying to explain what the term complexity means in the context of the natural and social sciences. Because complexity is this term that's like, he argues that it's this word that's suddenly all over the place, but not everyone always uses it consistently or in the same way. And so what he's trying to do is kind of like clarify the definition of a seemingly ubiquitous term, right? So on the one hand, right, complexity is everywhere because the processes that shape science, business, law, manufacturing, most fields of human experience are now dependent on networks of specialists who have to understand complex phenomena. And complex systems or objects are those which include vast numbers of interrelated, interdependent parts. And even a tiny fluctuation within a complex system can change or disrupt the workings of that system. So I'll give you an example just from personal experience. So when I was in my early 20s and I worked in publishing, my department had a copy machine that basically did one thing, right? It just made black and white copies. That was it. That was the only thing it did. It rarely needed to be serviced, and it never broke down. A couple months into that job, that machine was replaced by one that did all sorts of other things for you. You could make color copies. You could it included a scanner. You could use it to pre-staple things that you had coming out of the copier, and that thing broke down all the friggin' time, right? Every other day, it needed to be repaired. Now, this is because the machine was more complex, right? There were more different moving parts. There were more interrelated parts. And if one of those parts wasn't working properly, then the whole machine broke down. So this is an example of how complexity within a system, right, or developing more complex systems, right, they're dependent on all of these different parts working together in harmony. And when they don't, then something else happens, right? The system isn't doing what it's supposed to do anymore. Urry also has a lot to say about complexity in time and space, right? The time and space are themselves complex phenomena. They're relative, right, to the individual experiencing them. They are relational in that they are defined by each other. They are not fixed, definite qualities because we all move through time and space differently. And again, right, time and space affect each other. They change one another. Right. This means that, that because they're changeable, right, what this means, they are dynamic, right, constantly shifting, constantly moving. So physical movement within space affects the flow and curvature of space-time. This is this is Einstein, Physics 101, right? And space, physical space, structures the possibilities for movement and action. So to give you an example of this, from a literary text, right? So one of the best known and kind of like most haunting scenes in King Lear takes place on an open plain in the middle of a storm where, Lear is, ranting and raving. And eventually he is dragged into a hovel to take cover from the rain, right? Now, what Lear can do within that space is limited by the material relationships within that space, right? If the hovel did not exist, if the hovel wasn't there, then Lear could not take shelter there, or frankly, anywhere. There is a scene later in the play where Edgar tricks his blind father into thinking he is jumped off of a cliff, right? And survived. And again, the trickery aspect of this, right, is again like bounded by the physical space itself, right? The place where Gloucester jumps and where the relationship between father and son is suddenly kind of altered, right? Determines what actions are possible. It's also probably worth mentioning some of the stuff that Urry says about negative and positive feedback loops within a system. So he describes a negative feedback within a system as feedback that kind of like restores equilibrium. Right? So when things start to go a little bit haywire, the negative feedback restores balance, restores equilibrium, returns everything to normal. Positive feedback, on the other hand, widens the cracks in a system, making it difficult or impossible to return to equilibrium. But this is a necessary step in pushing systems to evolve and adapt over time. Okay, so the last theorist we're going to talk about is Bruno Latour, right? Who, as we now know, right, is a French sociologist. He is influenced by semiotics and by deconstruction. Right? Deconstruction is itself influenced by semiotics. And he's best known for his description of what he calls actor network theory, or ANT. So actor network theory is not the study of individual participants or nodes in a network. Rather, it is the study of the networks that connect these nodes to each other. Right? So you're not actually looking at the actors within the networks, you're looking at the network. Right? You're looking at the connections. Latour calls it a method to describe the generative path of any narration. So this is something that sounds like it has a kind of direct literary application, right? In that we are tracing the ways in which information traveling between nodes in a network generates story, generates narrative, generates language. Latour also calls this theory a semiotics of things rather than meanings. And I'm trying to think of a good way to explain this in coming up. So semiotics, right, again, is that study of signs, right? And we're called like most signs are gonna, are most symbols that we use to represent concepts are essentially indirect, right? I think, like Thrift, what Latour is trying to get us back to is things themselves rather than abstractions that represent things or concepts. And like kind of like describing the symbolic relationships amongst things themselves rather than the meanings of particular symbols, if that makes sense. I say that a lot, don't I? Latour's theory proceeds from inductive reasoning, right? So he argues that the study of local peculiarities and the way they affect the way they affect connections with with other local peculiarities is more important than applying or discerning universal principles. So deductive reasoning is that kind of syllogistic reasoning where you take a universal principle, all human beings are mortal, and you apply it to a specific case, right? Socrates is mortal, or Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That's deductive reasoning, deductive logic, universal principle applied to specific case. Latour's theory arises more from examining many different specific cases and seeing how they link up to each other and how they're connected to each other and how they resemble each other. He's not even particularly interested in applying or deriving universal principles from any of this. He's less concerned with describing networks that have already been traced than explaining the ways in which networks trace themselves, right? So actor network theory is really more about how networks happen than what they look like once they have happened. I think you remember that thing in the quote above about the generative path, right? Generation, creation. Actor networks are created by the actors within them, not by outside planners. So they develop organically. And when Latour is talking about an actor or an actant, right, he is talking about anything that can serve as the source of an action. Actors usually for Latour are concrete structures or objects, and actants are the kind of more abstract structures of ideas. Actors are also dynamic, circulating objects within a system. They are not fixed entities. So again, we've got that focus on movement, on circulation, on sharing. All right, so what do we do with all this when it comes time to try to apply it to a text? Well, we're going to go to one of my old favorites again, Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. And we're going to look at it in terms of movement through time and space. So we actually see Ebenezer Scrooge in his present day London inscribing patterns of movement of his own by making consistent and prescribed journeys to the same places in the same order every day, right? So Scrooge's spatial movement is very much kind of like bounded by his habits and his profession at the beginning of the novella. And then we introduce temporal distortion and spatial distortion as well through the visits of the four spirits, right? So Marley's ghost is an example of something or someone from the past intruding on Scrooge's present. And the three spirits of Christmas allow Scrooge himself to travel through time and space, right? To places outside of London, to times outside of his own presence. We also see that time and space are relative within the narrative, much as Urry argues they are relative and relational to begin with. The only pasts and futures that we see or that are specifically visited are Scrooge's, right? Though the present is the exception there. They've been shaped by his choices and actions. This also is true of things that are going on in the present, right? Where Scrooge is actually more sort of like present in the form of his absence at the Cratchit's party and at his nephew's Christmas dinner. And the future is actually altered through actions taken by Scrooge, right? He won't have, like, none of the things that happen in the future episode are going to happen because of actions Scrooge then takes in his immediate present, right? He changes these prescribed patterns that he was kind of locked into. And this alters time. It's also probably worth thinking a little about complexity in time and space, right? That the eras and places in Scrooge's life form a web of connections that affect each other, right? Who Scrooge is in the present is shaped by his experiences as a boy and as a young man. And the future that he envisions is shaped by his behavior in the present. So removing any of these actions or any of these people from the system changes the whole structure of Scrooge's history, right? The fact that he decides to stop being a dick to the Cratchit family means Tiny Tim will not die. We can also think about Scrooge as an actor within a network, right? So he is a node in a system of exchange, but he's a node that hoards instead of distributing, right? He's in the center of a particular system, a particular network, but from that his central location, he blocks connections between others by limiting the circulation of capital, the circulation of emotions, right? There's affective circulation that goes on here as well, and also the circulation of ideas. There are certain things he just won't hear of. But his change in relations to money and to other people ends up creating new networks, a new kinship network with his nephew and his nephew's wife, a new professional network with Bob Cratchit as something more like an equal. A new charitable network, and a philanthropic network, right? As he makes a donation to the charitable gentleman whom he threw out on their ear in the first chapter. All right, so I hope you have some sense now of how new materialism works and what you can do with it, or how you can apply it to the reading of a text. So I will post prompt questions on the discussion board tomorrow. That's Tuesday the 12th. And we'll see you there for further discussion.